I'm with an organization, Friends of Smith Springs, and I'm a local yokel here. Live about 40 miles from Carbondale.
How long have you been involved in forest issues?
Well, I've been involved with the forest for my entire life. But as far as with the various controversies, the various threats that are affecting our forest, it's been probably, I don't know, more than 25 years. The first place I went out of high school was to forestry school, to a 2-year industrial forestry school. And I went the first year and took botany and dendrology and forest soils and surveying, because I just wanted to work in the forest. And then when I looked at the curriculum for the next year, it was basically logging, 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 and logging. It was all about chainsaws and heavy equipment. And I got to reassessing the forestry program itself, as well as my own values, and I realized that I did not want my relationship with the forest to be one of extracting things from the forest. I wanted I value the forest for amenities that are like just regenerating my spirit and making me more physically and mentally healthy. And in those days, I was probably more concerned with myself, with the benefits those amenities that I was getting from the forest. And in the years since, I've come to appreciate the forest for itself. And I realize that whether I'm here or not, that forest is far more important than I am. And not just to me, but to people and to all the creatures that inhabit it, from the mycorrhizal fungi down in the soil to the insects and the tip tops of the trees.
So, could you give us just a little sketch, maybe a 30,000 foot view of what's happened over the last 30, 40, how many years in the Shawnee National Forest in this region? Because there was a time there's been a lot of litigation, there's been a lot of local residents concerned and concern across the nation about the forest, but what has been the status, what has happened, and what's the status now? Is this a forest under threat?
When I first became acquainted with this forest, I had grown up in a coal mining community. I've worked underground in the coal mines myself, third generation coal miner. And so growing up in an area that was surrounded by mine spoils, I thought that was normal. But on weekends, my father would take me down very near where I live now, surrounded by Shawnee National Forest, to Burden Falls and Smith Springs. And I did not understand what the different components of the forest were then as a small kid. I just knew that I enjoyed my neighborhood. I enjoyed riding my bikes up and down those coal mine spoils and hiking through those hills that had been the coal mine area. I just knew that when I got down into the forest on weekends, it felt magical. There was just and that's where that physical and spiritual regeneration comes from. And that's why I wanted to study it and learned what the different components were that made this so different than the rest of Southern Illinois. I'm 65 years old now. When I was a kid, the forest was much younger, and the areas that have been left alone have only gotten better and better through those years, through my lifetime. I was somewhat indoctrinated from that 1 year of forestry school, however, to believe things like, in order to keep a forest healthy, you have to cut it. That clear cuts imitate nature. This is what we were taught. That in order to have oaks and hickories, you have to cut the big oaks and hickories. So I believed that for a long time growing up. And then it was hard to escape that indoctrination. because it came from people who I thought were here to protect the forest, and I believed them. And so after spending a couple of decades away, when after I married and my wife was pregnant with our daughter, we both decided that there's no place we would rather raise our child than down in the Shawnee National Forest. And one day I was walking by a newspaper machine, and I saw the top headline story had a map in it, and it had my house on it, McCormick, Illinois. At one time in McCormick, Illinois, back in the late 18 and early 1900s, there were 2,200 people lived there. But when I moved there were only 8 or 9 people that lived in that little ghost town. And it was now surrounded by what is now National Forest. And so when I saw this newspaper article, the headline was, "Clear Cuts Okayed Near Eddyville." And again, it had a map with my house on it. And I read the article, and I thought, oh, okay, the Forest Service, whom I still trusted, says that it's a good idea to clear cut some of these areas. And so I wanted to bid on the timber sales. So I called up the ranger in charge of that project, who was mentioned in the story, and I said, how does a guy go about getting, bidding on these timber sales? And he explained to me I needed to get on the bidders list, and I needed to get the maps of the timber sales. So I did that. I got out and I walked those timber sales, and even with my 1 year of forestry school, it made no sense to me, because the timber they were proposing to clear cut, was oaks and hickories, our native hardwoods, which can grow to be 6 feet in diameter, and they were looking to cut thousands and thousands of them that were pole size, that is 6 to 10 inches in diameter. So that made no sense to me, and it was on very steep slopes, on very thin soil, and none of this was what I was taught was proper procedure, even in an industrial forestry school. And so I called that ranger up, and I said, I think there's some mistake here. I said, I cruised that timber, and something's not right. The trees are too small, the slopes are too steep, the soil's too thin. I said, what can I do to change your mind about this? And I had just come from 3 years, my wife was in the military for 10 years, and I had just come from 3 years of working for the Department of Defense, and I knew that in federal bureaucracies there are always layers of procedure. So when I asked that guy what I could do to change their minds about it, he just laughed and said, "I'm sorry, buddy, it's a done deal." So the other person besides him, Ranger Jim Johnson, who was mentioned in that video, who was mentioned in that newspaper article, was a guy named Joe Glisson, who ran the General Store in Pomona, Illinois. So I called up the Pomona General Store and asked to speak to him, and I recounted the conversation. I said, hey, this guy told me there's nothing I can do about this. And Dr. Glisson said, well, didn't he tell you that we're in a public comment period on these timber sales now? I said, well, no. And he said, well, didn't he tell you that if they make a decision that you don't like, that you have a right to appeal that decision? I said, no. And he said, well, didn't he tell you that if your appeal is denied, you have recourse in federal court? And I said, no. He told me it's a done deal. And Dr. Glisson says, well, that guy lied to you, didn't he? So Joe Glisson, who's now one of my very best friends, started explaining to me. We met, and he started explaining to me what was going on the other side of the forest, over around the Fairview timber sale. And I was still very skeptical of environmentalists. But over the course of time, as I studied deeper and deeper into the issue, I came to realize that I was being lied to by the Forest Service, and I had been lied to by the timber industry and the things that I was taught in that industrial forestry school. And if my love of the forest wasn't enough to motivate me, the anger I felt at having been betrayed and deceived really threw some fuel on those flames. So again, in the years that have passed, I've seen successes on this forest in stopping projects, like clear cutting and other commercial extraction that should not be happening on the forest. I've seen success in that, and to fast forward a number of years, eventually an attorney who was with a big corporate law firm in Chicago got involved with us, and he too fell in love with these Shawnee hills, and he was able to obtain, with the help of folks like Dr. Glisson and Mark Donham and many other local folks, our attorney Tom Buchel was able to obtain an injunction in federal court, which lasted for over 17 years, that halted all logging and oil and gas drilling on the Shawnee National Forest. During those years, when we had the injunction in place, people like me grew complacent about protecting this forest. We thought, it was just easier not to fight those battles than it was to fight them. And so we thought we were safe because we had this court injunction in place. And we thought that society and our government would evolve in their thinking as well, in terms of valuing the forest the same way we did. Well, when a few years ago, when there was an imminent threat of fracking in southern Illinois, I believe that was the impetus to cause the Forest Service to request that the judge lift that injunction against logging and oil and gas drilling. And the Forest Service was able to convince the judge that they had concocted a new forest plan which would live up to the values that the Forest Service was supposed to be administering the forest under. And so the judge lifted that injunction. And as soon as he did, the Forest Service fell right back into the old pattern of, rather than valuing the forest for the amenities it provides, like clean air and clean water and stable soil and habitat for wildlife, the Forest Service went right back to using the Shawnee National Forest as a means of providing corporate welfare to the timber industry. And if they had the opportunity, they would provide that same corporate welfare to the oil and gas industry. So since then, I'm very regretful to say that the Forest Service has authorized several timber sales on the Shawnee, which have amounted to several hundred acres that have been cut already. And they have thousands and thousands of acres in the pipeline that they would like to cut pretty well everything on the Shawnee. And during the time that court injunction was in place, the Forest Service took that opportunity to convince some of the big green environmental groups that not only logging, but burning and spraying poisonous herbicides were also part of their management plan. So that's what we're faced with now, is that the public education campaign that we engaged in 25 years ago, which exposed the Forest Service for the frauds that they are, had sort of receded into the back of people's memories. It's historicide. They killed that history and replaced it with a new false one. And that's what we're fighting today. Now,
so Sam, that's very. Does it feel maybe like 18 years ago again, in a way, or is it different?
Here at the Convergence, it feels like that.
Feels like what?
It feels like there are people from all over the country and throughout different strata of society who feel the same way I do about this forest, who want to protect this forest. And it feels like here at the Convergence, there is an air of activism that is just ready to be directed in how to protect that forest again, like we did 18 to 25 years ago.
Let's talk a little bit about that. You and Joe Glisson and others did yeoman's work with litigation and public education. And then there were also, I guess, protests and things like that as well. Did you see them as both essential, one more essential than the other, or how did you see all that working together? The people filing, and some of the people filing the briefs were out there protesting too, of course. But did you see that? How do you see that working together? Do you anticipate more legal action in the future here as well?
Well, protests and public education and litigation, all three are necessary to protect the forest. The protests serve to get the public's attention. Then, once their attention is back on the forest, then people can work to educate them, as we did 25 years ago, about the difference between what the Forest Service and the timber industry and their allies tell us that they want to accomplish, the difference between that and what would really be accomplished by logging, burning, and spraying poisons on the forest. So one part is each part is as essential as the other, but unfortunately, ultimately, even after the public gets educated about that the forest needs their help and protection again, and they can contact their politicians, and that's necessary. I used to think that we could shame the Forest Service into doing the right thing. Well, as it turns out, they're shameless, and it takes the only thing that they listen to is litigation, is court orders, and the only thing that affects the timber industry is doing things which will lessen their profit margin. And I used to be proud to tell Forest Service and timber industry guys when we would be nose to nose at timber sales that I'm $1 million man. It's my intention to cost you $1 million to get any timber out of here, and there's lots of guys like me out here.
And let's talk about that real briefly. So what was going on 17 years ago was that there was logging by private companies on public land, and maybe the Forest Service was subsidizing that activity. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the Forest Service provides this corporate welfare to the timber industry.
Could you explain what that
Yes,
corporate welfare is?
it's through some archaic laws called the KV laws, the Knudsen-Vanderburg laws. And the bottom line on that is what it amounts to is the more money that the Forest Service can lose selling our timber off of our public land, the more money they'll get in their budget the next year. They don't have an incentive to protect the forest for its own sake. But and in a nutshell, the way that works is, among other ways, very simply, is through purchaser road credits. For example, if the Forest Service sells a tract of timber for $100,000 to the timber industry, one of the first things they do on paper is give the timber industry maybe $60,000, $80,000 in purchaser road credits. They pay the timber industry to build their own logging roads. Now, if they were buying that timber from a private individual, they would have to absorb the cost of logging roads themselves. But because they get credit for building any logging roads, they can get $100,000 worth of timber for $20,000 to $40,000. So that's I understand that, the timber industry's incentive on that. As far as the Forest Service, as using our Shawnee National Forest, our public land, for something like that, if the Shawnee National Forest were a 270,000 acre cornfield and we were subsidizing farmers to grow corn on there and paying them, for most of their expenses to grow corn, farmers would be up in the air and outraged. But because people don't understand that that's what's happening with the forest, they're not as outraged. But Anybody, regardless of their political persuasion, unless they're profiting directly from the forest, once they understand that these so-called the euphemisms they use for logging, such as ecological restoration and group selection and gap phase dynamics, those are all just a smokescreen to cover up this corporate welfare we're talking about.
Sam, thank you so much. I would like to ask you about the Convergence. One final question. People coming from around the country to talk about various issues. Do you think the Convergence coming to the Shawnee is going to be helpful?
Well, it's certainly going to be helpful for the Shawnee because it's serving the purpose of the protest aspect of educating the public. We're getting some attention, and here at the Convergence, people who love the forest like I do are receiving their own education about what's happening, which they will carry back to their various communities all over the country, and it will, if one of us is stronger, one national forest is stronger, has stronger protection, it'll benefit all national forests.
Perfect. I'm going to pull it out, and we're going to stand up, and I'm going to go shake your hand if that's okay. Now, come on.
I'm sorry, man, but a handshake won't do.